Welcome to Secure Software Development. We're going to begin this class the same way we begin every class, by talking about how printers work. So, different printers have different capabilities. Some print at high resolution, some print at medium resolution, some print in color, some print in grayscale. There's a ton of different printers out there. You can print on acetate or paper. There are 3D printers that do whatever 3D printers do. Lots of different printers out in the world. So, how do you interface and connect with the printer? Well, you have to speak the printer's protocol. And that might be any of the ones listed there or many, many others. So you have to implement all these protocols, and maybe a new printer comes along and it's got a slightly different version of that same protocol, and maybe it's incompatible with the prior version. So if you just have, this version of PostScript, but a new printer comes along, you have a different version of PostScript, you might break an old printer. So that's a problem. In addition, printing is slow, right? It takes a while to, in the case of laser printers, it takes a while to melt plastic and then have it cool. So communications are fast. I can send a document over to the printer like super fast, but then it's going to take time to print. And for a long document, there may not be enough memory in the printer to hold the whole document. So the host computer needs to monitor the printing process. It needs to alert the user if there's an error. The printer is going to communicate that in different ways. It's all a big complicated mess. Simple solution, just never print. But unfortunately, that won't work. So instead, we have a thing called a print spooler. A print spooler is software that manages the printer and print jobs and capabilities of the printer for us. It provides an application with a way to find the printer, figure out what the printer does, send print jobs, monitor the result, etc. On Linux and on Mac OS, the print spooler is the Common Unix Printing System, or CUPS. And so, what does CUPS do? Well, CUPS is pretty neat. There's a C API. There's actually APIs in many different languages, including in Python. And over on the right side of the screen, you can see an example of me on one of my computers just doing some stuff with the CUPS API. So up at the top, I install PyCups, which is the Python interface to CUPS. I start up Python, I import CUPS, I make a new connection, I get the printers from that connection, and then I print out all of the printers that I got. And you can see I got a couple from Oak Ridge. I got a Brother printer, which is one my wife uses, and I got the badge printer from Oak Ridge. There you go. What about adding a printer? So every printer needs a printer driver. That's that specialized software that talks the right language to the printer and knows how to interpret signals from the printer and how to prepare documents to be printed. So adding a printer is the sort of thing that a normal user will likely need to do at some point. So adding a printer is often something that a normal, unprivileged user can do. Not always, but often. On Microsoft Windows, printers are added with the RPC add printer driver X RPC call. And you can read a little bit about it over there on the right-hand side. The idea is I plugged in a new printer. I need to be sure that the printer driver gets installed. So here we go. The printer driver is usually on Windows distributed as a DLL, a dynamic linked library. And so that DLL needs to get put somewhere. The system needs to be made aware of it. We need to add an entry in the registry for it, etc. The DLL contains executable code that will run to set up the printer, maybe when you power on the computer or when you power on the printer. And that code gets run whether or not anyone ever uses the printer, right? You have to do this setup phase, and that may happen whether or not you ever use the printer. There are some printers that don't store their firmware between reboots of the printer. They download it from Windows every time they start. And so you have to have that stuff on Windows ready to go. Now, this is an RPC, or a remote procedure call, and that means it's possible to add a printer driver on a remote server. At least in theory, it's possible. Now, just suppose that we create a malicious DLL, and we add our malicious DLL to whatever machine is serving as the print server. And then we wait for exciting things to happen, because our malicious DLL will get run to set up the printer. And that means that our code is now running on this other computer. So we do need to log in on the remote system to make this all work. But that can be any login, it turns out. Suppose I have an anonymous share. Suppose there's an anonymous share on that remote computer. A share that anyone can see. Great. I can use that to, quote unquote, log in to the computer and install my malicious printer driver. The best part about this is the code runs with system privilege level, since that's what the spooler runs. That's not administrator. And you might think, oh, that's good. It's not administrator, it's just system. But it turns out that's actually worse, because system, unlike administrator, doesn't necessarily have to authenticate to all the other servers in the domain. And that's kind of a problem. So it turns out this is actually a serious vulnerability known as PrintNightmare. And if you'd like to go see some code to exploit it, there you go. There's a link to a GitHub repo where you can go and find the code. This one actually gets up into the Olympic range. It gets to an 8.8, which is pretty good. Might get a bronze for that. And there actually is more than one CVE associated with this particular problem. And that's not that unusual. Sometimes you'll have several CVEs that will come out of a vulnerability. And sometimes vulnerabilities will live on, right? There'll be a problem. It'll be detected. People will diagnose the vulnerability. They will fix it, but the fix won't be sufficient. The vulnerability will live on. They will discover it again, and they'll fix it again and again and again and again, because there is something fundamentally insecure at the lower levels of the design of the system. And that's been the case with the way Windows communicates and authenticates across domains for a while. And so what do you do? What's your mitigation for PrintNightmare? Just patch, and then maybe patch again. And when you do these patches, sometimes printers may stop working because they are set up and configured and programmed in a world in which certain things are true. Those true statements lead to vulnerabilities, so we go and fix the code so those statements aren't true anymore, which can then validate these older printer drivers. Alternately, you can just disable the whole print spooler and just don't print. And that's great, because we're saving trees. Is it great? They grow these big forests of trees just for printing. So really it incentivizes people to plant more trees. It's hard to say. But trees are cool. Would you like to know more about it? I've linked you to a video. It's a walkthrough of PrintNightmare. It's pretty enjoyable. So what happened? What was the problem here? Well, the problem is that a trust decision was made, right? The decision that I'm going to trust this DLL, because after all, it's just a printer driver. I'm going to trust that without considering the trust assumptions of the print spooler, right? The print spooler is then going to assume somebody somewhere vetted this code, and it's going to run it in a system that has a fairly high privilege level. But was it ever vetted? Maybe not, right? So what do these words mean? A trust decision is an assignment of a trust level to an object or subject within a system based on something, some computation, some analysis. Maybe we check a hash, maybe we check a certificate, but we come to a conclusion about how much we want to trust something. And ideally, we base that on some good evidence. In this case, we based it on the evidence that someone said install it. It's not great evidence because really what we're doing then is trusting the person who's installing it and not trusting some system to validate our trust. A trust assumption, just what we have, is an assignment of a trust level to an externally originating object or subject, right? So what we're doing is we're violating that little maxim I gave you last time. We are trusting a thing and not necessarily having anything that is trustworthy. This is also an example of crossing a trust boundary. Well, what's all this trust words? What's a trust boundary? So more language for you. A principal is a person, a computer, a process, a thread, a service, any other entity that can be authenticated by a computer system or network. So it's typically some active thing, right? It's code that's running, or it's a person that's typing, etc., right? It's some active thing that we have now made a decision about trust, and we've authenticated it. And that principle has a certain trust level associated with them. Now, there can be lots of different principles, and those principles might have different trust levels, right? For example, I might be in one category, right, deeply untrustworthy, and Mike Rogers, who is without flaw, would be in a different trust category because we all trust Mike Rogers. Now, a trust boundary then exists between us, right? The trust boundary is the interface where information that passes from one principle to another may change a level of trust or where there are different policies governing it, right? So I write a report and I give it to Mike Rogers. That report crosses the trust boundary, and so Mike has to remember that this report is untrustworthy and treated as such. Mike writes a report and gives it to me. Oh, great, I trust it completely because it came from Mike Rogers, and I validated that Mike has a high level of trust. Trust boundaries can be internal to your system, and you always have an external trust boundary. The Linux kernel, for example, has an external trust boundary that it tries to enforce. If you look at some device drivers, you'll see a user tag applied to functions or to types that indicates that that is something that originates outside the kernel and therefore outside of the kernel's trust boundary and have to be treated as such. So you need to verify your trust boundary, right? Figure out what that is. For a large system, that can admittedly be hard, but maybe you don't draw the boundary around the entire system. Maybe you draw smaller boundaries around parts of the system. This encourages you to segment your system so that you can make more localized trust decisions, which turns out to be a good thing to do. And trust assumptions, or the assumptions that you make at the boundary, need to be documented and then communicated, right? Perhaps I'm going to assume that if the operating system hands me some data, I can trust that data. If the user hands me some data, well, it might be suspicious because the user could have been compromised. Perhaps it's more likely the user is compromised than the kernel. So I'm more willing to trust the kernel than the user. You have to document these decisions and make the ones that are reasonable to the system that you're building, based on some stuff we'll talk about later on. Implications for software development, well, identify trust boundaries. Define the sensitivity of information flows. What do I mean by that, right? Well, information might be stuff that's not sensitive, right? That is perhaps just state information as the system runs. It might be information that is sensitive. It might be session hashes or that kind of information that could potentially be used in a replay attack or to hijack a session. It might be information that is sensitive because there are laws governing it, like personally identifiable information, protected health information, etc. So be aware of what the information flowing in your system is. Verify the identity of endpoints, where there are flows across a trust boundary, right? Know your user. And we'll cover all this a lot more when we get to Zero Trust. So classify the information in your application based on the trust level. There could be passwords. Those are pretty sensitive. Personally identifiable information, official use only stuff, maybe even classified stuff. You have to be aware of what this stuff is in order to make the right kind of decisions, and then document those decisions so that you and others who come after you are aware of the decisions that have been made. Minimize the places in your application where sensitive data is stored, processed, and transmitted. So I need to elevate to do something. So I need a password to do it, perhaps. And that password leads to maybe a token that I have, a session token. I don't necessarily need to pass that session token to every single process, because there might be a chance that at some point I end up dumping the session token out and somebody can pick it up, right? Maybe I tricked you into printing it with Log4j or some other technique. So minimize the place where it's stored, right? Maybe restrict where that is, and then make sure that when you're dealing with that, you take positive steps to avoid leaking the data, like erasing the data. So, explicitly overriding it. And then be sure that you've made doubly sure the compiler didn't erase your attempt to erase the data. Okay? Lots of things to think about here. Try to decouple data at different levels of sensitivity. What do I mean by decouple? I mean separate the processing of that data wherever you can. So if I have a function, let's say, that needs data at several different levels of sensitivity, I can ask the question, can I break this function up so that the most sensitive data is used only by a small function that just handles one piece of the computation, right? So I further isolated the use of that very sensitive data. Can't always do that, but often it turns out that I can, right? You want to buy something, I can do most of what you want to do without ever having to deal with credit cards. It's only at a particular point that I need to then get your credit card information and conduct a transaction to pay for something. And I can limit the scope of that information as much as possible so that it's not just spread everywhere in the system. Because then if there's a weakness somewhere in the system, I may not be able to get that information, right? That weakness may not lead to me being able to get the highly sensitive data. And of course, only load specific information when you need to. Compartmentalize, limit scope, and erase sensitive data. So let's take a brief moment and let's have an aside here. But by the way, did anybody, so last time I mentioned a band, at least in class. I'm not sure I did on the recorded lecture, but I mentioned a band. We had some homework. The homework had some names in it, and I happened to mention that some of you might recognize them or not. And so did you recognize it, or did you look them up? And maybe some of you did, and you might wonder, why would I bother with indicating that particular band? And it all comes back to something called Sleepify. This is an aside, but I think it's an interesting aside from a security point of view. So the band was Wolfpack. Wolfpack is an American funk band, and they hail from Ann Arbor, Michigan. That's where a lot of these bands come from. And they're sort of semi-famous for selling out Madison Square Garden without a manager and without a label. They just advertise on Instagram. And you may recognize some of those names over there, right? You might recognize Woody Goss, Joe Dart, Theo Katzman, and Jack Stratton. And if you are really into music, you may recognize Joe Dart right off. So there they are. What has Wolfpack got to do with any of this? Well, that takes us to an album they released in March of 2014 called Sleepify. So here's part of a review from Tim Jones in The Guardian. He says, the opening track, Z, certainly sets the tone, a subtle, intriguing work that teases the listener as to what may come next. It's followed by ZZ and ZZZ, which continue along similar lyrical themes while staying true to Sleepify's overriding, minimalistic, perhaps extremely minimalistic, aesthetic. By the midpoint, you realize Wolfpack are aiming to pull the same trick as the Ramones. They may only have one song, but it's an effective one. What is that one song? It's complete silence. The album is several tracks, roughly 30 seconds each, of silence. And why is this a good idea? Why would you produce an album that's all silence? Well, Wolfpack produced this album, and by produced, quote unquote, I mean they created it and loaded it to Spotify, and they encouraged their fans to listen to it on Spotify, on loop, while they slept. And this led to Spotify owing Wolfpack about $20,000 in royalties. Now, they initially fought this, but ultimately they ended up paying the royalties. And then Wolfpack in turn used this money to fund a free concert for their fans, which is kind of cool. They exploited a weakness in the system in order to accomplish a different outcome, right? Nothing in Spotify is set up to pay for concerts. But Wolfpack reasoned that because of the way Spotify worked, they could use it in this way. And in their defense, the people actually streamed the music through Spotify. So, I mean, they did owe them the money, and they did pay. If you'd like to know more about it, there's a video recorded by Wolfpack telling you all about how this is going to work and asking you to go listen to it. Here's the original video here. There you go. So what does this mean in terms of software development? Well, all systems are vulnerable. I keep saying that. That's true for all these systems, right? And the point to take away from this is a system is a tool. And these sets of rules and policies and constraints and components that make up a system are themselves tools. And you can use those tools for a variety of different purposes, right? Some are maybe what the tool was intended for. Some are maybe the off-label uses of it. Some may be very sketchy, and some may be outright malicious, right? But a tool can be used in a number of different ways. And that takes us to the main topic for today, which is threats. Now, I had a student in the class ask, what is a threat? We will maybe get to that at some point, but for right now, we'll go with this working definition. A threat is any circumstance or event with the potential to adversely impact operations. That's so clinical, right? A threat is something bad that might happen while you're trying to do your work, right? You're sitting quietly in your room, you're studying, you're doing your homework. The threat is that maybe your dog needs to go outside, and so you got to get up and let your dog out. Or maybe your dog needs to come back in because you just let them out. Or maybe they need to go out because you just let them back in. Dogs are like that. Or maybe you have kids, in which case the threat is constant and just always hanging over your head. So threat can be a lot of different things. A circumstance or event can be things like unauthorized access, destruction, disclosure, modification of information, or denial of service, right? What is your dog doing? Your dog is doing a denial of service. The impact can be in effect on any or all of the following, right? The mission of whatever your application or your organization is, the functions of your organization, what it's trying to accomplish, your reputation or your corporate image, right? I mean, you are a security company, let's say, and you release some software that takes down part of the internet, just hypothetically. That looks bad for you. That's not going to be helpful for your stock price. It won't reassure your investors. It could be bad. There's lots of things that can go on, and all of those things are threats. And you might notice I didn't necessarily say, and in the one concrete example I gave you, there wasn't necessarily a malicious actor, right? The threat could be that, I make a mistake, which leads, let's say, to a denial of service, which hurts my reputation because I didn't check something before releasing it. Not that that would happen this year famously, but those are all things that can happen, and that's a threat. Now, typically when we think of threats, we think of a malicious actor behind it, and we'll typically use it that way. But I want you to remember that it doesn't have to be an external malicious actor. You can DDoS yourself, right? You can do an unauthorized disclosure of information all on your own. Okay, and we might see some of that, right? An own goal, it does happen. Okay. So let's think about threats in terms of the system, right? The system consists of lots of stuff. There's hardware, there's a physical systems, right? Servers in a rack, sensors out in the field, actuators that control motors or control floodgates or whatever. There are devices, there are servers, all that makes up the hardware. There's data in the system. There are channels to communicate that data around the system to make it go where it needs to be. There are services, there's software, there's policies, and there's personnel. And those are just the things I could think of when I was making the slide. The threats could be data exfiltration or data corruption, right? Either one of those is a threat. Data that is sensitive gets leaked. That's a problem. Data that I need in order to do my work gets corrupted. That's a problem, right? Suppose that I am operating a big system like a power grid, and I suffer some kind of an outage. One of the problems of coming back from an outage is that I don't have state information about the system. What was the position of the switches in the switchyard? What's the status of floodgates? What's the status of anything? Right? I have to then collect all that information and rebuild my state information before I can take positive actions with any surety. So data corruption is a problem. Unauthorized access is clearly a problem. Denial of service is very bad. Disclosure of secrets and sensitive data, that's not good. And destruction is probably particularly bad. It might be good in some cases because maybe my response to a threat is to destroy the data you're trying to steal, and therefore I protect the data. But maybe that's what the adversary wants, and now my operations are down while I take time to recover from backups, right? An example of that might be ransomware. The data from my point of view has been destroyed, and I need to recover it, and if I don't have backups, I may be on the hook for some money to pay someone to restore the data. So, thinking more about the threats to a system, why would we take the time to enumerate these? Why would we take the time to catastrophize what might go wrong? Well, that's because it changes how we design a system, right? We talked earlier about how you would want to design the system so that you have restricted the sensitive data to the smallest possible footprint of the system. That is to protect that data, right? We are using information about a threat, that data would be disclosed or stolen or maybe destroyed, to influence the design, leading us to compartmentalize and reduce the scope of that information. It's great. That's what we want. We want to know this stuff early so we can make decisions about the design of the system. If we do that well, we have a much more firm foundation. So as we move forward, we're not constantly having to refight the last battle, right? We don't constantly have to worry about some new vulnerability in the way in which we, let's say, talk to printers or talk to network shares or talk to remote network devices, right? And so we have a much more firm foundation. It can also lead us to add additional functionality. Why would we add more functionality to the system because of this? Well, we might do things like cross-check data. An example of this is something called CRCs, or cyclic redundancy checks, hashes, all these kinds of things. They can let us detect tampering, right? If one of the threats is the data we have could be tampered with, then we might want to redesign part of the system to make it possible to detect tampering, right? Ideally, we'd like tampering to be impossible, But we already know no system is going to be perfect. No system is going to be perfectly secure. We can't achieve that. But we can do things to help us detect when something goes wrong, like when someone corrupts data. And that leads us to the topic of threat modeling. So threat modeling basically tries to answer the question, what are the threats to your system? That's it. What are the threats? Just write them all down. Well, that's kind of vague. I mean, I'm going to sit down with a blank piece of paper and I'm going to think, what are the threats to my system? Well, someone could unplug the servers. I mean, I don't know. So a way to do this is to follow a process of doing threat modeling. And we'll look at a number of different ways to do it. But for right now, let's try to figure out what I'll call an ad hoc system. So if you don't know, an ad hoc just sort of means loosely guided or whatever's at hand. And what would we do? Well, we might ask the modeling questions that are over there on the right. And these come from a document called the Threat Manifesto, which you might want to read. It's not very long. It was produced by a number of experts in the field. It's interesting and it's worth taking a look at. What are we working on? What are we doing? What is it we're doing? Are we building the guidance system for a ballistic missile? All right, we probably have one set of threats related to that. Are we building the guidance system for an autonomous robot that will do search and recovery? Okay, maybe that's a different set of threats. Are we building a system to trade Bitcoin? There are financial pressures involved and maybe yet another set of threats. So answering the question, what are we working on, tells us a little bit about who might be coming after us and what the threats might be. What can go wrong? Right? What could go wrong with our Bitcoin trading system? Right? We spent the time to very carefully hack something together in Python that seems to run. What could go wrong? Well, we could be fined by the FTC. We could go to jail. People could lose a lot of money. We could lose a lot of money. I mean, there's lots of things that can go wrong, and we should probably make a list of those and worry about them at least a little. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to just worry about it? Sometimes that's the right answer. This may seem really counterintuitive, but sometimes the answer is, I don't know what to do. There's not necessarily a good solution to this particular threat. I'm just going to choose to worry about it because I don't have an obvious way of dealing with it. And sometimes that's reality because we live in an imperfect world. And then finally, did we do a good enough job? And we ask ourselves that question in order for us to be able to answer it with no, which means we have to keep going through the process of updating our threat model. Threats are always evolving. And we've seen a little bit of that over the course of this class, right? You do everything right, but it turns out someone comes along and discovers a property of the physics of memory that lets them subvert your system. Right? There's lots of things that you don't know and realistically can't know when you're building your system. All right. The point is, threat modeling is a creative exercise. Right? We can try to systematize bits of it like asking these 4 questions, but at the end of the day, it's going to be you thinking about your system and the things that can go wrong, and it's going to necessarily be creative. So we can ask the question, what are you working on? And in this case, what you want to do is identify the components of your system and figure out how they interoperate. So I'm going to need a database. I'm going to need a way to take input from external sensors. I'm going to need a way to send information to remote sites. And, vulnerabilities often occur at the interfaces. So I've got to think about trust boundaries at the interfaces. When I send that information out, how do I figure out that the endpoint I'm talking to is the endpoint that I intend to talk to? Do I authenticate them? Do I do some kind of attestation? What do I do to figure that out and verify that? Vulnerabilities often occur when some possible inputs aren't properly handled. What if someone feeds me negative temperature numbers or like weird other values. Do I handle those correctly, or do I have some kind of a problem? And vulnerabilities often occur when a convention is violated. For me to know that, I have to know what the convention is. So I have to say, I assume X. Now I've discovered something, right? So I look at my code and I say, I assume the first thing is the name of the program. I assume that. And so I have to ask the next question, which is, what if it's not? Do I know for a fact that it will be? It might not be. And you may remember that, well, Linux did something about that. They patched that. Did they? The assumption is the first argument is the name of the program that's running. But that's not actually how Linux patched it. They patched it by putting the empty string in there. That could lead me to make the same mistake again, right? Once again, I could be assuming that's the name of an executable, doing stuff with it, and winding up potentially vulnerable again. So keep your assumptions in mind, right? Ask about each part of it, each part of these interfaces, each part of the connections, and draw a picture, right? And just sit down and remember, computer science is the study of boxes and arrows. So draw some boxes and connect them with arrows, right? The arrows would be the information flow or the control flow, and the boxes will be different parts or modules or components or pieces of hardware that make up your system, right? What should they be? Whatever makes sense for your system. Draw a picture. That leads us to this simple ad hoc threat modeling process, right? Ad hoc meaning without a particular process. Identify significant components with boxes, connect the boxes with arrows, label the arrows with the data and the information that flows. Doing this silly little exercise. You may think, that sounds silly. Why am I doing that? That by itself is a form of requirements analysis. So you know what your system should do, but you probably know that in some abstract, imperfect, maybe unevaluated way. And doing this requires you to start writing things down on paper, and it can lead to you discovering things about the system that you weren't even aware of when you initially thought about it. Anytime that you use something like a system description or a document or documentation of a system, you discover new things about it, right? Using something is different from writing something, right? Using your software is different from writing your software. When you write it, you may make decisions that are expedient to you getting it written. And then you turn around and try to use it, and you're like, this is unusable. I should change all these things, right? So requirements analysis is a process that can help you confront all that earlier on. And this is a form of requirements analysis, so it's probably worth doing. I don't want you to go down the road of doing busy work, right? Don't do busy work. If something feels to you, if you're like, this feels like busy work, it's probably not adding value, okay? Do things that add value. So once you've done this, you ask yourself, what can go wrong? Right? You look at each of the boxes and each of the arrows, and you try to decide what could go wrong here. What if someone sends bad data? What if data is lost? What if a component fails? What if this little arrow breaks and I can't communicate? What if I run out of memory? What if one of these little boxes goes down, right? That server fails, or someone trips over a power cord. What happens then? Okay, and you have to answer these questions, and sometimes the answer is, okay, well, here's how I can address that. And sometimes the answer is, I don't know how to address that, so maybe I don't. So you can go on with this kind of thinking a long time. Sometimes it comes easily. Sometimes it's hard to think of all these things, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with the system you're building. You typically are going to be building, when you're out in the world, you may be building a system that is novel in some way. You're not building the same kind of system someone else has built. It'll have a lot of similarities, but if someone has already built it, you're probably not going to rebuild that system. You might, but you're probably not. You're probably building something that has some novelty somewhere in it, which means no one solved that problem before, so you have to stop and you have to think about these things. And one way to to help you think about this is to have things to prompt you, right? To get your brain going, to get you thinking about threats. One possibility is the threat card game, the denial of service card game. You can see some of the cards off on the left side of the screen here. So for each thing you think can go wrong, consider how to handle it. And you could directly address it. You could indirectly address it. You could change the architecture. You could change the problem. What I mean by that, you could remove features, right? You can change the kind of thing you're trying to do, or change the way in which you're trying to do it to remove the problem. Or you could just document it. You could say, I think this could be a problem. Here's forewarning for people in the future. This might be a problem, right? That gives something for people in the future to look at. Maybe they'll have a way to solve it, or they'll at least have a way to check for it. Or at the end of the day, you could choose to ignore it, right? It's often a good idea if you document it anyway, but sometimes the right answer is, I don't know how to address this. I'm just going to have to ignore it, right? I launch a probe out into space. What if it's hit by a comet? That seems unlikely. It certainly could happen. What do I do to avoid that? I guess I could, try to plot. I don't know. Some of them are too small for me to see them from Earth and plot their orbit. I can't do it all. So I guess if that happens, it just happens. And did we do enough of a job? Well, maybe for now. But keep in mind, the threat landscape evolves. So you're going to need to go back and revisit this analysis if you want your system to remain secure. Your system may change, right? People are going to ask for new features. If your system is successful, people will ask for new features. People will demand new features. The world around you will change and come to expect new features. And so you'll have to address that and make changes to your system. And when you do that, you need to revisit your analysis, because you can make changes that break your former security. We've seen that in some of the examples we've seen, and we'll see it in more yet to come. When something in your system depends on changes, like an underlying library, you may have to go back and redo the analysis, right? Because yesterday, that combination was secure and you felt confident about it. But today they've made some changes and you're maybe a little worried about that. And so you need to actively think about, what do I do to address that? When there are new threats, right? What do I do about these new threats? And when you have the time to invest in thinking about the analysis, when thinking about this threat analysis, you may want to go back and redo some of the threat analysis. There are patterns that lead to better threat analysis, and they are to have a systematic approach, and we'll talk about some systematic approaches to that, right? The more you can sort of organize it, in one sense, the better, because you're now guaranteed to think about certain things. In another sense, maybe that's not so good, right? If it's super systematic, maybe you're not thinking outside the box enough, maybe you're not considering enough novel threats, but at the very least, you're considering a lot of the threats you need to consider. So more systematic approach is going to be an improvement. Inform creativity, right? Allow for creativity by including craft, science, other ideas, people from other fields, etc., right? Talk to your dog about it. Talk to your spouse about it. Talk to go out into the night and talk to the night sky about it. Whatever. Just get your brain going and thinking about this. Varied viewpoints. Have a diverse team. Okay? Different people have had different experiences, and they'll bring those different experiences to bear. I believe it was Honda who said that if you only hire people who are like you, the company won't get any better. Right? You have to have people who've had different experiences, who walk different paths through life, and they'll bring those to bear, and they can make things better. A useful toolkit. There are tools that will support doing threat analysis, and we'll talk about some of those. And theory into practice. Using successfully field-tested techniques. that, again, align to your local needs, because your system is a unique system, very likely a unique system, informed by the latest thinking on the benefits and limits of those techniques. Remember, I told you that when you adopt these tools, you have to then learn about them and learn how to correctly apply them to your particular challenge. Well, that's going to be true for any of these, right? You can't just grab one of these. Well, sometimes you can, but for the most part, you can't always grab one of these tools and just plop it down and have it go, right? A static analysis tool may generate lots of spurious false positives, and you may miss a signal because of all the noise. And so you have to learn how to tune that to your particular environment, context, and your particular problem. There are also some anti-patterns. You don't want one guy being the threat modeler, right? It's like Jim will do it all, right? We'll just let Jim do the threat modeling because Jim is awesome at threat modeling. No, that's probably not good. That's probably not a good idea. Admiring the problem, right? You go beyond just analyzing the problem, right? Reach for practical and relevant solutions, right? Don't just say, this is cool and this is so neat, right? You have to, at the end of the day, have actual things that you can implement, that you can maybe change, that you can take ownership of to make the system more secure. Don't lose sight of the big picture, right? Don't say the real threat is this one little communication channel, and we have to do everything we can to secure this one little communication channel, and ignore everything else, right? Right? We're going to build a wall defending all of France from Germany, and we're not going to worry about Belgium because we're friendly with them. Right? So be aware of this, right? Avoid this excessive focus on one kind of solution while ignoring that the problem, any real problem, is going to be a multifaceted thing, right? A real problem is going to have a lot of different facets to it, and it's unlikely that one particular approach is going to solve that problem, or even mostly solve that problem. It's better to create lots of different threat modeling representations than to have a single idealized view, right? I draw my system and I'm like, that's the system right there. But maybe as I look at it, I realize, I really don't have one database. I really actually have two databases. And maybe a threat is that I end up with stuff decoupled between them, and I lose my ability to track data. That's a thing that can happen, right? I have these foreign keys in a database, and the one database gets corrupted, and now I've lost all the information in the other. File systems are an example of where that can happen. So sometimes you end up needing multiple different representations of your system in order to do a good analysis. All right, enough of all that. Again, perfect security is impossible, and you can't list all the threats because some threats rely on knowledge you don't have and you cannot reasonably get, right? You just don't know that this is out there. You don't know that Log4j has this feature. You don't know that people are exploiting memory in this way. These are things that creep up on you, and so you'll never be perfect with this, but you can do a better and better job and be able to then effectively defend against cases where this sort of thing happens, or at least be able to detect it. So let's talk about a maybe a little more systematic approach. We'll get more of this later, but this might get you well started toward an analysis. So let's start with a question. Let's start with the question of harm. An adversary can be motivated to harm you. And the question is, how would they do that? Well, let's stop for a minute and let's think about the system. Right? We're going to assume they're going to do this through the system. Right? They're not going to stalk you and run you off the road. They're going to attack your system. And so the first question we should ask is, who are the stakeholders of the system? What do you mean by stakeholder? Stakeholder is a term that came out of, I'm tempted to say MITRE, but I think that's wrong. It's older than that. I can't remember exactly where this came about, but the idea is that a stakeholder is any member of a group whose support the organization needs in order to continue to exist and function, right? So that could be the owner, right? If the owner is gone, then I'm in trouble. That could be management, right? Some layers of management are probably necessary. Maybe not all of them, but certainly I need some of them. The customer, I probably need my customer, or I'm not sure what it is I'm doing. Investors, I might really need investors. And the list can go on and on from there. So a stakeholder is somebody who has a stake in the thing that we are building or that we're doing or our organization. And therefore, they are important. Something about the system constitutes value for the stakeholder, and the stakeholder constitutes some value for the system, right? There's some mutual thing going on. So, because the system represents value to the stakeholder, we can ask for each stakeholder, what's the value of the system to that particular stakeholder? And for each stakeholder, what would cause damage, or what could cause damage to or loss of that value? Okay? So going through this process will lead us to think about ways in which an adversary can harm us by breaking this value chain with one of our stakeholders, right? They maybe part of this is that we maintain customer data, and all that customer data is lost, and we lose our ability to do that particular mission. Maybe we lose our customers as a result of this. We might lose investors. This begins to break things down, and it's a problem. So how could an adversary interfere with the system to deny value to one or more of our stakeholders? Another question, misuse. An adversary might be motivated to misuse the system to accomplish some goal. And so we then have to ask a question, what can our system do? And what are the current uses of the system? Why did we build this, right? What does it do? What additional uses could the system be put to, right? We built a system to do X. Could it do other things as well? And that's a good thing to think about, whether you're threat modeling or not, right? What else could we do with this system? And is there a potential gain from these other uses? And that leads us to ask, how could an adversary use the system to affect an undesirable outcome? And this is more ideation, this is more creativity. And it sort of feels like the alternative uses test. So this is the test devised in 67 to assess creativity, right? We give you an object. The classic example is we give you a brick, and we say, come up with as many uses for this thing as you can think of in a limited amount of time, right? What can I do with that brick other than like build a house? So think of the different things you might do with it and write all those down. Same thing for your system. And you should expect your adversaries to be good at this. Another question, value. An adversary might seek out our system and seek to exploit it for its own intrinsic value, right? Our system does something, right? Maybe we have a point of sale system and they want to be able to exploit it to get money or to get free stuff or to avoid paying for stuff or to steal someone's information so they can buy stuff, right? The data flowing through our system may have value. And so we have to ask questions like, what is the value of the data stored and maintained by the system? What is the value of the products of the system, right? Can someone tamper with the system? Maybe we build something. And one threat might be that an adversary finds a way to use the system to steal some of the products of that system, right? They find a way to tamper with our system so that we ship our products to them when they shouldn't be getting them. What's the value of the inputs to the system? Go the other side, right? The input side, steal inputs to the system. And finally, what's the value of the system itself? If they can take over the system and manipulate it to their own ends, that may be what they're trying to do. That may be the whole game. Can an adversary steal data from the system, inputs to or outputs from the system, or maybe the entire system? And what does that look like? So there's homework. It's due on Tuesday. The homework is going to be to consider the Graham-Denning system, execute that script over on the right-hand side, and give me back the final access matrix. In addition, I want you to think about the safety principle, the idea that only the owner can grant rights to an object, and answer the question, does the sequence of events described violate this principle? And ideally tell me how it violates the principle. Don't just say, yep or nope, but tell me why it is that you believe the system violates that principle. That's it.